The alarm didn't so much chime as it shrieked, a thin, metallic scream that sliced through the pre-dawn gloom of the tiny apartment. Imani Washington's hand shot out from beneath the thin blanket, slapping at the battered plastic clock until the noise stopped. 4 a.m. Darkness still clung to the city like a shroud. She lay there for a moment, the chill of the room seeping into her bones. The radiator in the corner had given up the ghost 2 weeks ago, and the landlord just shrugged when she called. "It's an old building," he had said, his voice bored. "What do you expect?" Imani expected heat. She expected running water that didn't come out brown for the first 30 seconds. She expected a window that didn't rattle with every passing truck, letting in a draft that felt like a phantom's touch on her neck. But expectations were a luxury she couldn't afford. With a groan, she swung her legs over the side of the pull-out sofa that served as her bed. The floor was like a sheet of ice against the soles of her bare feet. She was tired. She was hungry. She was alone. Well, not entirely alone. From the small, partitioned-off area that was technically the bedroom, she could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of her mother. That sound was the only thing that kept her going. It was her fuel, her reason, her everything. Imani tiptoed to the small kitchenette, her movements practiced and silent in the dark. She filled a kettle with the murky tap water and set it on the single working burner of the stove. While it heated, she opened the refrigerator. The little light flickered on, illuminating the bleak contents. A half carton of eggs, a wilted bunch of celery, a plastic container with leftover rice, and, on the top shelf, a row of small vials, her mother's medication. That was where every dollar went. Every single cent she earned from her 2 jobs, every ounce of her energy, was poured into keeping that top shelf stocked. The water boiled. She made instant coffee, black and bitter, and a bowl of plain oatmeal. She ate standing up, staring out the rattling window at the sleeping city below. Her first job started at 5, a diner 20 blocks away. She used to have a car, a beat-up sedan that smelled like old coffee and gasoline, but it had died a final, sputtering death last month. Now she walked. In the rain, in the cold. She walked. She finished her oatmeal, rinsed the bowl, and got ready for the day. Her uniform was clean but faded. The cheery pink of the waitress dress bleached to a sad pale rose. Her shoes were worse. The soles were worn so thin she could feel every crack in the pavement, every stray pebble. She had stuffed them with cardboard, a temporary fix that had become depressingly permanent. Before she left, she crept into her mother's room. Eleanor Washington was asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light filtering in from the street. Years of illness had stolen her strength, but not her grace. Her hair, once a vibrant black, was now threaded with silver. Imani gently pulled the blanket up to her mother's chin. "I love you, Mama," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't afford to indulge. She kissed her mother's forehead, a silent promise to keep fighting, to keep working, to make things right. Then she slipped out of the apartment, locking the 3 deadbolts behind her, and descended into the cold, dark world. The diner was a blur of activity. Hot coffee, sizzling bacon, demanding customers. Imani moved like a machine, her smile fixed in place, her voice a pleasant, "coming right up." No one saw the exhaustion in her eyes. No one saw the law degree gathering dust in a box under her sofa bed. No one saw the brilliant legal mind that was currently calculating tips and memorizing breakfast orders. They just saw a waitress, a black woman in a cheap uniform there to serve them. And that, for now, was all she could be. At 2 in the afternoon, her shift ended. She collected her tips, $32.47, and began the long walk to her second job, a janitorial position in a downtown office building, cleaning up after people who had the lives she was supposed to have. People in sharp suits with easy smiles and futures as bright as the polished floors she scrubbed on her hands and knees. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but she swallowed it. Every day. Tonight, however, was different. She didn't go to the office building. Tonight was the night she had been preparing for. The culmination of 6 months of secret, exhausting work. Instead of turning left toward the gleaming skyscrapers, she turned right, toward the old, imposing structure of the county courthouse. Back at her apartment, after checking on her mother and making her a simple dinner, Imani began her final preparations. She pulled a long, black garment bag from the back of her closet. Inside was her suit. It was the only one she owned. A simple black pantsuit she had bought for her law school graduation. It was worn at the elbows, the fabric shiny from too many ironings, but it was clean. It was professional. It was her armor. She laid it out carefully on the sofa. Next, she retrieved a worn leather briefcase. Inside were not the textbooks of a student, but the meticulously organized files of an investigator. Notes, transcripts, financial records, photographs. For months, she had lived a double life. Waitress and janitor by day, tenacious legal investigator by night. She had been poring over documents, following leads, connecting dots that no one else could see. She had sacrificed sleep, food, and what little social life she had, all for this, all for tomorrow. She barely slept that night, her mind racing. The next morning, she repeated her routine, but with a humming, nervous energy coursing through her veins. The diner, the tips. But instead of walking home, she went to a public library to change. She washed her face in the cold water of the restroom sink, scrubbing away the smell of grease and coffee. She carefully put on the black suit. Looking in the cracked mirror, she saw a flicker of the woman she used to be. The confident, ambitious law student, ready to take on the world. But her eyes were different now. They were older, harder. They had seen too much. She pulled her hair back into a severe professional bun and took a deep breath. It was time. As she approached the courthouse, a grand stone building with pillars that seemed to scrape the sky, her steps faltered for a moment. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. Who was she to do this? A broke waitress with worn-out shoes and a threadbare suit. What chance did she have against the power and prestige housed within those stone walls? Near the entrance, an old man sat huddled on the steps, his clothes ragged, his face etched with hardship. He held out a trembling hand, not asking for money, but just existing in a state of quiet desperation. People streamed past him, their faces averted, their briefcases swinging. They didn't see him, but Imani did. She saw the hollow look in his eyes, a look she knew all too well. She stopped. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the small wad of tip money from her morning shift. $32. It was her grocery money for the next 3 days. It was her mother's bus fare to the clinic. It was everything she had. A voice in her head, the practical, cynical voice of survival, screamed at her. Don't do it. You need that money. He's not your problem. A co-worker at the diner, a woman named Brenda who had seen it all, had warned her just yesterday. You can't save everyone, honey, Brenda had said, refilling a sugar dispenser. You try, and you'll just drown with them. Look out for yourself. No one else will. Imani looked at the old man, then at the imposing doors of the courthouse. What was justice if it didn't have compassion? What was the law if it didn't protect the most vulnerable? Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, a warm and steady presence. Kindness costs you nothing, Imani, but it's worth everything. She walked over to the man. She knelt so she was at his eye level. "Sir," she said softly. He looked up, surprised. His eyes were a faded blue, clouded with cataracts but still sharp. "Are you hungry?" she asked. He gave a slow, tired nod. Imani opened her hand and pressed the crumpled bills into his palm. All of it. "Get yourself something hot to eat," she said, "and a coffee." The man stared at the money, then back at her, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Tears welled in his eyes. "God bless you," he whispered, his voice raspy. "No one's looked at me in years. My name is Samuel," he added, a flicker of pride in his tone. "It's nice to meet you, Samuel," Imani said, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "My name is Imani." She stood up, her pockets empty, but her heart a little fuller. She felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Samuel, for her mother, for everyone the world had forgotten. She squared her shoulders, walked up the marble steps, and pushed open the heavy bronze doors of the courthouse. The inside was a cavern of polished marble and echoing voices. Lawyers in expensive suits bustled past, talking into cell phones, their voices sharp and important. Bailiffs stood guard, their faces impassive. Imani felt a fresh wave of intimidation. She looked down at her own worn suit, her scuffed shoes. She was an imposter in this world of wealth and power. She clutched her briefcase tighter and checked the docket. Courtroom 4B. Judge Alistair Finch presiding. She found the courtroom and slipped inside, taking a seat in the back row. The room was already filling up. It was a formal hearing, a disciplinary review for a city official accused of misconduct. But everyone knew it was just a show. Judge Finch was known for his leniency toward the powerful and his cruelty toward the weak. He was a king in his own little kingdom, and his word was law. Imani watched him take the bench. He was a man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair, a florid face, and eyes that were small and cold. He surveyed the courtroom with an air of supreme arrogance, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him with unconcealed disdain. The hearing began, a tedious procession of legal jargon and procedural maneuvering. Imani waited, her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands were clammy. She had a role to play. Her presence here today was not as a spectator. The case before the judge was a smokescreen. The real trial was about to begin, and Judge Alistair Finch was the one in the dock. He just didn't know it yet. Finally, after an hour, Judge Finch called a recess. As people began to file out, Imani stood up and walked toward the front of the courtroom. This was her moment. A bailiff moved to intercept her. "Court is in recess, miss. You can't approach the bench." "I have a matter to bring before the court," Imani said, her voice steadier than she felt. Judge Finch, who was gathering his papers, looked up, annoyed. His eyes scanned Imani from head to toe. He saw the cheap suit, the worn shoes, the exhaustion she couldn't hide, and he saw that she was a black woman. A sneer curled his lip. "What is it?" he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you one of the public defenders? Lost your way to the arraignment court? That's downstairs with the rest of the riffraff." A few of the remaining lawyers in the room chuckled. Imani felt a hot flush of anger and shame. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But the reality of his contempt was like a physical blow. "No, Your Honor," she said, keeping her voice even. "I am here on a different matter." She placed her worn briefcase on the prosecution's table and clicked it open. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Judge Finch's eyes narrowed. "I don't have time for games," he snapped. "This is not a game, Your Honor," Imani replied, her voice gaining strength. "This is a formal inquiry." Finch let out a short, barking laugh. "A formal inquiry? And who exactly are you to conduct such an inquiry? You look like you just wandered in off the street." He leaned forward, his face turning a blotchy red. "I've seen your type before. You think you can come into my courtroom and make a scene? You think you're entitled to something?" He gestured expansively around the room. "This is a temple of justice. It has standards, decorum. You clearly have no respect for either." The public humiliation was beginning. The remaining people in the courtroom were now watching intently, some with smirks, others with a dawning sense of discomfort. They were the bystander chorus, watching, recording on their phones, but not intervening. "Your Honor, if you would just look at the documents," Imani began, but he cut her off. "The documents? I'm not looking at anything you have. You have no standing here. You are a nobody." He pointed a trembling finger at her. "Bailiff, remove this woman from my courtroom. She's in contempt." The bailiff, a large man with a weary expression, took a step toward her. "Ma'am, you heard the judge. You need to leave." Imani stood her ground. "I have a right to be here," she stated, her voice ringing with a conviction that gave the bailiff pause. This surprised Judge Finch. He was used to people cowering. He was not used to defiance, especially from someone who looked like her. His anger morphed into a cruel, theatrical display of power. "A right?" he scoffed, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have no rights in here except for the ones I grant you. Now you're clearly confused. You must be the defendant in some petty case. Let's see." He shuffled through some papers on his desk, pretending to look for her name. "Public intoxication? Shoplifting, perhaps? That seems to be a popular one with your people." The racist barb hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. The room fell silent. Even the smirks faded from the lawyers' faces. Imani felt the blood drain from her own face. She felt small, powerless, exposed. But then she thought of her mother. She thought of Samuel on the steps. She thought of the years of struggle and sacrifice that had brought her to this exact moment. And the fire returned. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You are mistaken." Finch's face twisted in fury. He stood up, his black robes billowing around him, making him seem larger, more menacing. "I am the judge in this courtroom. I am never mistaken. You are a disruptive, disrespectful, and clearly uneducated person who is trespassing in a federal building." He leaned over the bench, his voice a roar. "Now, for the last time. This is not a social services office. This is a court of law. You need representation. So tell me," he sneered, his eyes filled with venom. "Where's your lawyer?" The question echoed in the silent room. It was the ultimate dismissal, the final act of humiliation. He had reduced her to a helpless, ignorant defendant in need of saving. Imani looked him directly in the eye. She took a deep, steadying breath. She let the silence stretch, drawing every eye in the room to her. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and sharp as a shard of glass. It cut through the tension, filled with all the authority he had tried to strip from her. I am the lawyer, Your Honor. The words landed with the force of a physical impact. Judge Finch blinked, momentarily stunned into silence. A ripple of murmurs went through the handful of onlookers. Then, the judge recovered. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a horrible sound, full of genuine, cruel amusement. You're a lawyer? That's the funniest thing I've heard all year. Let me guess. You got your degree from a cereal box? He turned to the bailiff. I'm done with this farce. Get her out of here now. If she resists, arrest her. The bailiff moved forward again, his hand reaching for her arm. Imani didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply said, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And just then, the main doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Two men in dark, impeccably tailored suits entered. They moved with a quiet, confident authority that commanded attention. Behind them walked a taller, older man. He was a black man, with a halo of white hair and a face that radiated wisdom and gravitas. He wore the robes of a judge, but they were the more ornate robes of a higher court. It was Justice Marcus Thorne of the Federal Appeals Court, a living legend in the legal world, a man whose integrity was beyond reproach. Judge Finch's jaw dropped. His arrogant demeanor vanished, replaced by a look of utter shock. Justice Thorne, he stammered, his face going pale. What are you doing here? This is an honor, but unexpected. Justice Thorne did not smile. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his gaze fixed on Judge Finch. The two men in suits flanked him like sentinels. I am here, Alistair, Justice Thorne said, his voice calm but resonant with power, because I was invited. He stopped beside the prosecution table next to Imani. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. By her. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it shattered. Judge Finch stared at Imani, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The cheap suit, the exhausted woman, the connection to one of the most powerful judges in the country. It didn't make sense. I don't understand, Finch faltered. Who is this woman? This woman, Justice Thorne said, his voice ringing with pride, is Imani Washington, Esquire, a graduate of Harvard Law, summa cum laude. And for the past 6 months, she has been serving as special counsel for the Judicial Conduct Investigation Committee. The reveal hung in the air. Special counsel. A position of immense power granted to investigators looking into the highest levels of corruption. Finch's face, which had been pale, turned a ghostly shade of gray. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of his bench for support. That can't be real, he whispered. Oh, it is very real, Imani said, finally allowing a sliver of cold anger into her voice. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy binder. She placed it on the table with a loud thud that echoed in the stunned silence. This is my report, Judge Finch. A 6-month investigation into your judicial misconduct, bribery, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. She opened the binder. It's all in here. Bank statements from your offshore accounts. Recorded conversations with known criminals whose cases you dismissed. Sworn affidavits from the clerks and bailiffs you've bullied into silence for years. Finch's knees buckled. He sank into his high-backed chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. No sound came out. He was no longer a king on his throne. He was a cornered animal. The men and women who had been snickering just minutes before were now staring, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. They were witnessing the spectacular fall of a titan. One of your key witnesses, Imani continued, her voice relentless, was a court clerk you illegally fired 2 years ago for refusing to lose a piece of evidence. A man you ruined. A man you threw out onto the street. His name is Samuel." She paused, letting the name sink in. "I met him this morning, on the courthouse steps. You didn't even recognize him, did you?" Finch just shook his head, sweat beading on his forehead. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened again. This time, it was 2 United States Marshals in full uniform. They walked directly to the bench. The lead marshal looked at Judge Finch, his face grim. "Alistair Finch," he said, his voice formal and final. "You are under arrest by order of the United States Department of Justice." The collapse was complete. The consequence was immediate. The marshals came around the bench. One of them took out a pair of handcuffs. Finch began to blubber, his arrogance replaced by pathetic pleading. "No. Please. This is a mistake. A misunderstanding. Thorne, you can't let them do this." Justice Thorne looked at him with cold disappointment. "You did this to yourself, Alistair. You dishonored the robe you wear. You tainted the very concept of justice." The handcuffs clicked shut around Finch's wrists. The sound was deafening. The marshals pulled him to his feet. The once powerful judge was now just a disgraced old man in a black robe, being led away like a common criminal. As they walked him past the prosecution table, his eyes met Imani's. They were filled with a toxic blend of hatred and disbelief. "You," he hissed. "You did this." Imani met his gaze without flinching. She stood tall, no longer the humiliated victim, but the vindicated authority. She gave him no response. Her silence was more powerful than any words could be. After Finch was gone, the courtroom erupted. Not in applause, not yet, but in a wave of shocked, excited chatter. Justice Thorne raised a hand for silence. He turned to Imani, his expression softening. "You did well, Ms. Washington. You did more than well. You were brilliant and brave." Imani felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked her off her feet. Relief, exhaustion, and a profound, earth-shattering sense of vindication. She had done it. She had actually done it. Justice Thorne then addressed the remaining people in the courtroom. "Let what you saw here today be a lesson. Justice is not a privilege for the wealthy or the well-connected. It is a right for all, and it must be blind to the color of a person's skin, the quality of their clothes, or the contents of their wallet." He looked back at Imani. "This woman, who your judge dismissed and insulted, is the very embodiment of that principle. She endured hardship and prejudice to uncover a rot at the heart of our system. She is a hero." And then, the applause started. It began with one of the young lawyers in the front row, a woman who had looked away in shame during Finch's tirade. Then another joined in, and another. Soon, the entire room was filled with thunderous applause. It was a wave of sound, of support, of pure cathartic release. They were clapping for her, for Imani. Tears she had refused to shed during her humiliation now streamed freely down her face. They were tears of joy. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The story was everywhere. Waitress lawyer brings down corrupt judge. The secret investigation that shook the city. Imani Washington became a household name overnight. Her picture was on the front page of every newspaper, not as a suspect, but as the face of integrity and courage. The Department of Justice held a press conference. Justice Thorne stood at the podium and publicly praised Imani's work, calling it one of the most thorough and courageous undercover operations he had ever seen. He then announced that Imani had been offered a permanent position as a senior prosecutor in the Public Integrity Section. The job came with a six-figure salary, full benefits, and the resources to continue her fight for justice. The first thing Imani did was call her mother. "Mama," she said, her voice breaking, "you don't have to worry anymore. I'm going to take care of you." She arranged for her mother to be moved to the best private hospital in the state, with round-the-clock care from top specialists. The day she moved her mother out of their tiny, cold apartment was one of the best of her life. But the rewards didn't stop there. A crowdfunding campaign was started for her by an anonymous well-wisher. Donations poured in from all over the country, from people who had been inspired by her story. The fund quickly grew to over $250,000. One afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up outside her new, modest but comfortable apartment, a place with reliable heat and clean water. The driver handed her a set of keys. "These are for you, ma'am," he said. Confused, she looked outside. Parked at the curb was her old sedan. But it wasn't old anymore. It had been completely restored. A new engine, new tires, a gleaming new paint job. On the passenger seat was a note. "Thank you, S. Samuel." The clerk she had helped, and who had helped her in return, had used his portion of the witness protection reward to fix her car. The material rewards were overwhelming, but the symbolic ones meant even more. The city council voted to rename the community law center in her old neighborhood the Imani Washington Center for Equal Justice. It would provide free legal services to those who couldn't afford them, ensuring that no one would ever have to face the system alone. Meanwhile, Alistair Finch's ruin was absolute. Faced with the mountain of evidence Imani had compiled, he pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid a lengthy, humiliating trial. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. His wife filed for divorce. His name was stripped from the law school wing he had endowed. His portraits were removed from the courthouse walls. He was erased, a monument to his own arrogance and prejudice, now reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. His complete and total destruction was a stark contrast to Imani's spectacular rise. It was a form of ironic justice that was not lost on anyone who had followed the story. 1 year later, Imani stood at the window of her corner office at the Department of Justice, looking out at the city skyline. Life was different now. She was no longer tired. She was no longer hungry. She was no longer alone. Her mother's health had improved dramatically with proper care. She now lived in a comfortable suite in a top-tier assisted living facility, where Imani visited her every day. Imani herself was thriving. She was a formidable prosecutor, known for her sharp mind, her unwavering ethics, and her deep empathy for the victims of the corruption she fought against. She led a team of young, idealistic lawyers, mentoring them, guiding them, and instilling in them the values she held so dear. Her work had a broader societal impact. Inspired by her case, the state legislature passed a sweeping judicial reform bill, nicknamed the Washington Act, which implemented stricter oversight and accountability for judges. The foundation bearing her name was a bustling hub of activity, helping hundreds of people navigate the legal system. She had transformed her own suffering into a source of strength and hope for countless others. But despite her new status and power, her core had not changed. She had not forgotten where she came from. That evening, as she was leaving her office, she saw a young woman sitting on a bench outside the building. She was a law student, judging by the stack of books beside her. She was crying, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. People in suits hurried past, just as they had hurried past Samuel on the courthouse steps. They didn't see her, but Imani did. She walked over and sat down on the bench. Is everything okay? She asked gently. The young woman looked up, her eyes red and swollen. She was a young black woman, and her face was a mask of despair. I can't do this, the student whispered, her voice choked with tears. It's too hard. The professors, they look right through me. The other students, they make me feel like I don't belong here. I'm drowning in debt and I think I'm going to quit. Imani listened patiently. She heard her own past in the young woman's words. She saw her own reflection in those tear-filled eyes. When the student was finished, Imani put a hand on her arm. It is hard, Imani agreed, and it is unfair. They will look at you and see 100 things before they see your talent. They will judge you on your appearance, on your background, on the color of your skin. They will try to make you feel small. They will try to make you feel powerless. She leaned in, her voice firm but kind. Do not let them. Your presence in those classrooms is a revolution. Your success will be a testament. You belong here. You earned your place. The student looked at her, a flicker of hope dawning in her eyes. How do you know? She asked. Imani smiled, a warm, genuine smile. Because I was you, she said. My name is Imani Washington. The student's eyes widened in recognition. You're... Yes, Imani said. And I'm telling you, don't you dare quit. You fight. You work harder than everyone else. And you remember that your worth is not determined by their prejudice. It's determined by your character. She stood up and handed the young woman her business card. Call me tomorrow, she said. My foundation has a scholarship program, and I'm always looking for bright new interns. We need more people like you. She performed this small act of kindness, this continuation of the cycle, not for any reward or recognition, but because it was who she was. Her virtue was not a product of her circumstances. It was the core of her being, unchanged by poverty or by wealth. As she walked away, leaving the stunned and inspired young student behind, Imani felt a deep sense of peace. The world was still full of Alastair Finches, but it was also full of people who, with a little help, could become the next Imani Washington. And that made the fight worthwhile. Have you ever judged someone by their appearance? Have you ever dismissed a person before you knew their story? Imani's story teaches us that true strength is not about the suit you wear or the title you hold. It's about the integrity in your heart. It's about the kindness you show to others, especially when you have nothing to give but compassion. Prejudice is a prison built of ignorance. It traps not only the victim, but the perpetrator, blinding them to the truth and humanity of others. Imani Washington broke out of that prison with the force of her character. She proved that one person, armed with truth and courage, can topple an empire of corruption. Her story is a reminder that you never know who you are talking to. The person you dismiss today could be the person who holds your future in their hands tomorrow. So be kind, be humble, and never ever underestimate the quiet power of a virtuous underdog. Because justice, true justice, always finds a way, and sometimes it arrives in the most unexpected of packages. Sometimes it wears a threadbare suit and worn-out shoes, and it speaks with a voice that has been silenced for far too long. And when that voice finally speaks, it has the power to change the world. The lesson is simple. Do not judge. Do not assume. Open your eyes and see the person, not the package. Because inside the most unassuming exterior might just be the heart of a lawyer, the heart of a hero, the heart of a warrior who is about to bring the whole corrupt system crashing down. and you do not want to be standing on the wrong side when it falls.